Hello, and welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Each episode, we talk about a particular topic in the life of a professor. Ruth is a visiting professor at a large university in Ireland, and Claire is an associate professor at a primarily undergraduate university in Northern California. The purpose of our podcast is reflection, so we bring something we think is working and something we're working on to discuss.
Welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. I'm Ruth.
And I'm Claire. And today we're talking about data organization. But first, Ruth, how was your week?
My week was really good. So I am still in the sort of new job sort of state at the moment. And I think I finally had an epiphany this week. And I don't know if it's true of our old job, but I always feel like meetings are things that are taking you away from work. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? And this week I was like, oh, this job is meetings. Right? So I kind of because I feel like I was resisting when people were scheduling meetings. I was like, oh, okay, if you have to. But then I was like, oh, wait, this is actually I always had a sense before of if I had a meeting, I almost needed to make up that time later on.
Yes, sure.
Do you know what I mean? Or
it's taking you away from what you actually need to do. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And it's because I guess the central thing we were doing is preparing for classes and preparing that stuff. Did you feel like that, or am I just a crazy person?
No, totally. I definitely felt meetings, you got to do meetings to organize whatever it is you're trying to organize. But usually whatever we're trying to organize is secondary to some other things that we're trying to do with teaching and writing or whatever. So I know what you mean.
So I think it's going to take me a while. I had that epiphany today, and then I was like, oh, but I think it's going to take me a while to really integrate that and
to be totally transition your mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Being in a meeting is work. That's my, anyway. Mm-hmm. So that probably doesn't sound revelationary to anyone else, but to me, I was like, wow.
No,
but
that's really cool. So now you can be
week?
Oh, I'm so productive. I'm in a meeting right now. Yeah.
Right. And I was like, okay, this is okay. Because, I think I had told you before we came on, but the girls were sick this week. So I was home. And I was like, well, I didn't do any work. And then someone was like, but you had 3 meetings. And I was like, right, exactly.
That's what I mean.
Wait, no, that is, yeah.
That's so funny. How interesting to have that mindset shift.
Yeah.
And,
that would be weird.
Even in your previous job, my current job as a professor, the meetings are work. It's just that we need to be sure that they don't take over because we are also doing other things. Oh,
totally.
You know what I mean? So anyway, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my new thing going forward. But tell me, what about your week?
My week has been really good. I just joined this writing group, fiction writing group, which I'm really excited about. I've been working on my novel, as I've been saying on here a few times, and I really felt like it'd be nice to have a group of people to touch in with, share a scene, chat about whatever plot thread isn't working, and then shortly after that, this email list that I'm on that talks about different aspects of novel writing sent out a thing saying, oh, a lot of people are looking for, writing buddies. And if you want a writing buddy, put a comment at the end of this blog. And then so many people put comments. And now I'm in this cool new writing group we just formed. And we're going to meet for the first time next week. But we've been chatting on Discord and sharing scenes. And anyway, I'm really excited about that. So that's been a lot of fun.
So meetings, more meetings.
Exactly. How productive, though.
Right, but that's so cool because, I'm sure in your day-to-day life you don't happen upon many people who are writing a novel or at least tell you about it. So yeah, but it must be very energizing.
It is very energizing, and it's also I don't know, some of the challenges of writing a novel I feel are hard to explain unless you've also been writing so it's just nice to have somebody with the shared experience to be like, okay, let's discuss how you've dealt with this problem that is kind of a weird, esoteric, hard to explain problem of writing a novel,
That's cool.
So that's
okay. I'm here for that. That sounds awesome. I want to hear more about that.
Cool.
Going forward. But tell me, do you have a quote for us?
I do, and it's from the anime Naruto. Do you know Naruto?
No.
Naruto is it's Japanese. And Naruto, I have a little summary of what it is on the back of this book here. It says Naruto is a young student with an incorrigible knack for mischief. He's got a wild sense of humor, but he's completely serious about his mission to become the world's greatest ninja. And anyway, It's really fun, motivational thing. And I have a quote from it that when I realized that Naruto said this, I was like, wow, that's the theme of my novel. So anyway, I wanted to share the quote. If you don't like your destiny, don't accept it. Instead, have the courage to change it the way you want it to be. And I just really like that.
I do like that. That's lovely.
So,
and I also, I want to, maybe we need to have an episode that's just about your novel. But yeah.
So, we're talking about data today. I am excited about talking about this because I have been doing a lot of stuff. So, my process with data, and I'm going to throw this in working, so I'm just going to jump right into what's working.
Yes, do it.
It involves... I have, data that came off of this instrument that I processed, and then I have this other data that came off this other instrument, and I have this data that I got from somebody, and then I'm just like, I just go wild in Excel, and I have all these different things I'm pulling together, and I'm plotting, and then I'm like, oh, maybe it would look good with this data from 5 years ago, and I pull that over, and it's all very hectic and chaotic, and if you look at the file 2 years later, I have no idea what it is. But I feel like that is part of me playing around with the data and just exploring it and thinking about it. And so I might have thought it was a problem that it's so disorganized when I'm playing through the data, but I think it's actually just part of the exploration of figuring out what it means. And so I'm like, oh, let me pull up this other data set. Is that related? Oh, it doesn't look good, actually. So it gets a little chaotic. But what I realized is it's not like I'm going to lose data. It's not... I guess what I'm trying to say is I have some organization in the madness. So when I started grad school, I got fantastic advice from then graduate student, current professor, Randy Bundy. And she said, you should get a notebook that is just for data. You'll have your lab notebook that's whatever else you need to write about the lab, but you'll have a notebook that's just for data. And that was fantastic advice, and I've kept that up. So I have a notebook that, all the, my particular analytical method involves you have to weigh things, and then, so each sample has several different masses at different stages along the analytical process, and then maybe notes about, I accidentally dropped this one on the floor, or whatever. So I have a notebook that just has that data, and it's not interspersed with my notes about, got to remember to make more buffer, or whatever. That's in a separate notebook. So that's initial phase of the data, it's all organized. Then when I get data off the instrument, that data all goes in to one folder with the same naming convention, so all the data, the raw data from the instrument and the process data from the instrument's all organized. So I'm not going to lose anything. Then after that phase, I go into this wild, every data set that seems like it might be relevant gets tossed together, and it's all wild and crazy and totally not organized. But again, I have the original data sets all accessible, so I'm not going to lose them. Yeah,
uncorrupted or unmastered.
Exactly. So I can be free to mix and match data however I want to make whatever plots I want to rearrange data, to pull different files together, and I'm not worried about losing that original stuff. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, but tell me about the notebook with the data. Mm-hmm. When you have a bigger file, like you said, from the instrument, do you record in the notebook, this is called this and this is where it lives, or is it just the notebook only for measurements?
Sure, good question. The way it works, my system, which is specific to my analytical process, but maybe could be applied to other people's. The notebook is I run a bunch of I prepare a bunch of samples for analysis on the instrument. So the notebook with the data has all the data that I need for each sample in the lab.
Okay.
But then I have a little note usually I have a header that says these samples are for this analytical run. I name it, river samples from the Little River Estuary, and then I have all the samples that are from the Little River Estuary and all the standards that go along with them, all of that. Then I go to the instrument, I run all those samples, I get a file out, and I name it the same thing as it was in my notebook. So it's cross-referenceable, so then I have the file saved on my computer. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Totally, yes.
Yeah. So, so I feel like what the key thing is, I really like my wild and crazy pulling data from all over the places to make figures and try things out and see how things compare. And, but I can see that would be concerning if I didn't have some way of going back to the original data and making sure that I know exactly what it is. And then kind of at the other end of that, after going wild and crazy, I eventually come up with, this is interesting. And we either write a paper on it, or we do this thing in my field where we intercalibrate data sets to make sure that my data looks good because it looks like your data. So once we've gotten to end goal, like we have intercalibrated or we've published something or whatever, then the data becomes organized again, because whatever data was in that figure for that publication is either in the supplementary info table or it's posted somewhere in some data repository. So kind of the middle is chaotic while I'm figuring out what everything means, but the beginning and end are organized, so I'm not worried about not being able to find things we need. Does that make sense?
Totally, yes.
So that's what's working for me, is kind of, I guess I had been thinking like, gosh, I need to get more organized with my data. I'm so chaotic, but I realize I am organized at the beginning and end, and I kind of like the freeform crazy free middle section.
Yeah, well, okay, so I have a couple of things written that are working for me, but the main thing that's working for me is you telling me about your process and me not feeling bad about my process. And you know what I mean? Because, like, first of all, this is maybe controversial, but dude, like, is the scientific method a thing, right? Because that's what always stresses me out, because I'm like, I don't have a plan. Like, I noodle around with stuff like you're describing. Mm-hmm. And then I'm like, I'm just this, like, chaos machine over here. But, like, what if that is the creative nice bit when you're like, ooh, what if we did do this and this? Mm-hmm. And, like, you know, that is, So I think that's really helpful that I'm hearing this. Because I think, like, the only thing you hear about other scientists is, like, and then they wrote down the scientific method steps, and then that is distinctly not what I do. But I think one thing that's working for me, too, is having had research students, and I had one in particular who was just an organization queen. Like, she was amazing. And she had, like, because I guess for me, it's not, well, data, obviously, but then also having code and, like, the original code, like you said, and then making sure that some student doesn't come along and, like, edit the original code and, like, that kind of thing. But she had a lot of, like, readme files that I have literally never done in a million years, but it was so effective. And she would just document everything, and this file is where this is, and this data set is, and, like, she just was so diligent about keeping track of everything. And I think that was particularly because sometimes there's, like, a battle between past Ruth and future Ruth, like, like, what were you doing? But then it's also in a research group, if you're handing over to a different student,
that's a good point.
That student is gone, you're like, what the heck was that all about? What were they doing? So I think, I love the way I'm like, this is working for me, that someone else did this and I saw it one time. But so maybe that's more of a working on, but it was really effective to see somebody do that. And I think the problem is, like, I have half started various data organization methods and never fully committed to one. So it was good to see a complete thing, if you know what I mean. So that was interesting. And then the other thing that's kind of, all of these could be in either category, but working is, like, I guess, you know, I'm kind of moving into this other job, and then a little bit when I was trying to sort of engage in education research, it's interesting to learn about how different people data is and how much more uptight you have to be about, like, where it's kept. And I just failed my IT thing, because it was like, should you put people data on the cloud? And you're like, sure. And they're like, absolutely not. So I was like, oh, okay. So that's really interesting.
Interesting. So you can't just email your colleague your data if it has all this
people stuff in it.
People identity things. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so, and I guess we do have that, right? Like a bit from grades and stuff. Like, you have to be pretty uptight about those things and keeping them organized. And grades is something I've never, like, I have so much fear about messing that up. And you know what I mean? Like, do you know the dread of having to go back and be like, hey, so what was your second midterm score? Or like something like that.
That is 100% not going to happen. We have to do that so we're sure not to lose the data.
So I think, like, that is something that I'm like, oh, maybe I just need to have that level of fear about other data in order to be more careful with it. But like you said, I've never, like, lost a data set or whatever, but it does feel like one thing. Yeah, anyway, I'll tell you this in a minute for the working on. Tell me what you're working on.
Well, first let me say, so you were saying, what about the scientific method and stuff at the beginning? And that was interesting to me. I mean, I feel like probably in both of our areas of research, we collect a lot of data, and then, you know, there's a lot of different stories that could end up coming out of that. You know, like, I often go into making measurements with a very specific hypothesis in mind, and I'm pretty darn sure that there's only a couple ways the data could shake out, and I've already figured out what they all mean, and then it comes up with mysterious option number 5 that I hadn't considered. And so then you do have to think about it. So I feel like it's still the scientific method. It's just we're exploring with data that we didn't know to expect or something like that. I don't know. That's really interesting about the readme files. I mean, that sounds like, I guess, the chaotic exploring data thing that I was describing is just me. You know, if I'm trying to coordinate with other people, of course I do have to put it in some semblance of an organization. Hey, here's an interesting graph, check it out. So that's really, but I love the idea that if you are exploring through this data as a group, having readme files, like here is where I tried to see if these two things were related in case you're interested, or I don't know, whatever. Would that be the kind of thing that she'd put in a readme file?
Yes, and so she kind of had like, I mean, and I guess for us too, it's the code, and it's like, you know, she would have, because this is something I'm going to talk about in a minute, but like naming conventions, and so she would have like, you know, nano length 8 refers to the code where blah 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 is happening, and do you know what I mean? So she kind of, and it's all that stuff, right, that you're like, I'll always remember what nano code 8 meant, and then funnily enough you don't. So she just like explicitly named them, which was great.
That's really nice.
The same, but I think, well, just a total side note, it's like, it's such a shame that we don't highlight that creative bit where you're just noodling around with stuff and seeing where you go. Because maybe that could make science more appealing to some people. Do you know what I mean? Because we don't anyway. Anyway, that's a side note for another day. But yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm working on, I guess, so I was describing my system, and I feel like I figured out my system really well in grad school. And in grad school, I had 2 main different ways that I got data. And I had, you know, both of them had their own filing system, and then from there I could go wild with the data. But now I have a few new instruments, I have a few new methods. I don't know, there's obviously more ways of getting data than those 2 ways I had in grad school. So I'm working on just incorporating new data sources into my system and figuring out, what am I going to do so that I do keep that. I think it's very important that I keep the original data organized in some fashion so that I can be free to go wild with exploring it once I have it. So I'm just working on figuring out how to make it an expandable system. And I think it's probably just each, like I keep talking about instruments because that's kind of how I get my data, but every time I have a new instrument, maybe I just have a folder for that instrument and a system for naming stuff that comes off of that instrument. And
this might be too exposing of a question, but I'm going to ask you, do you have like proper backup and stuff, like an external hard drive and all those things?
Oh, well, I just use Google Drive, and all of my data is synced. So it's on my computer and it's in Google Drive, and I figure that's enough, hopefully.
Sure, if we can't count on Google, then the whole world will basically end. So it's like the least of our problems will be the data from that instrument. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just working on making it, taking the good things and trying to figure out how to keep them going and not let it get too chaotic going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah. What about you? What are you working on?
I think just, you know, I like what you've sort of done, which is identify that your method is okay. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, one thing, like, it's so shameful if you actually saw my desktop and just the actual state of my computer. Do you know what I mean? So, like, there is, like, I would like to have some basic structure just to every, you know, whatever else on my computer.
You want more structure than you have.
Yeah, and then, like, a bit more of a file sort of naming convention and, like, keeping track of things. And I think I feel a bit self-conscious because in this new job, I think like basically all of it will be shared a lot more.
Ah, that might be great practice. You can learn some techniques.
Embarrassingly, yeah, totally. But yeah, exactly. And then seeing what other people do and just kind of following that. But yeah, it's a little intimidating.
Yeah, that seems really interesting. Yeah, I mean, yeah, all of my systems are entirely just for me to see, and then I send out the data that seems relevant to a student for them to work on, and then they send me back. So, like, I have very little experience with what you're talking about of having a system that is shared with other people that they also need to be able to use. That's interesting.
Yeah. So when you have with students, you don't just you just give them a chunk and then it comes back to you.
Yeah,
so they're not
I don't like to give them, I still have a copy of my file. I give them a copy of it, and then they go wild. Usually I'm like, oh, hey, explore this data, see if you can find trends with these kind of things, or look into the literature and see what might be interesting to explore in this data set that we have. So I give them something to go. Basically, I'm trying to give them the going wild creative time, but then they're not doing that within my system. Then they'll send me something back, and if it ends up being useful, I'll put it in somewhere. But they're not actually interacting with my system. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you're not running they're not going to accidentally delete the whole thing.
Right. And I think partially it's that, there's so many different students and they change over so quickly, and I want my system to maintain through all of them. And I suppose I could, the more I say this, the more I'm like, if I had more of those readme things, and if I had more guidelines, then they probably could interact with my system and have it go well. But currently my system is mine, and I send them stuff, and then they send me back stuff, and I reintegrate it to my system. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, my biggest takeaway from this episode is just my shameful secret about how I deal with data is well, at least there's two of us, so it's fine.
No, I don't think it's a problem.
Yeah, but it does feel like it's you're supposed to go into it with I am exploring how X depends on Y, and that's what I'm doing. And the noodling around bit doesn't feel, but it's part of the process, and it's fine. Mm-hmm. And I think, for me then, my biggest thing is trying to get a system, file naming, and then also I guess just learning, because no one cares what the 5th nanowire did in some network, you know what I mean? But then when it's people data, it's all a bit more loaded. So definitely.
Yeah, that's really interesting with people data. Do you do any work, when I've worked with people data in the past, which has been minimal, but it's been I send off a question to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and they send me back, here is your grades, but with added, I don't know, race
they
information.
It.
But exactly.
Yeah,
so I don't have the information about who's who, and in fact, it's not on the file. And so if anyone got that file, they wouldn't know what it meant.
Yeah.
Because I don't even know what it means in terms of an individual. Does that, or are you actually working with identifiable pieces of information?
So both. But then even in the past, I had to do, I wonder what it's called elsewhere. So for us, it was called an IRB.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember.
What did that
stand
stand for?
You have to apply to the ethics committee if you're going to do a survey or whatever. And so that would make me really anxious. But it would always have a section what's your data plan? Where are you going to keep it? How long are you going to keep it? And so that was definitely because I was collecting the information. And so that did have identifiers and stuff. So that would make me really nervous. But it was fine. I haven't had a massive data breach or anything, so it was okay. But I guess definitely stuff to think about. And I just was doing my training this week in my new job. One of the things they say, which I hadn't thought about, but it's just do you really need this data? If you're asking students sometimes, when you inherit forms and maybe it has it always asks for the address, but do you really need their postal address? Probably not. So, I guess that was really interesting to me, actually thinking more about, is this important? Do I really need this piece of information?
Yeah, what do you actually need to do whatever it is that you're trying to study?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And then what about, these days, whenever I'm trying to publish a paper, it'll say you need to make the data publicly available so that somebody could look and see. And there's these really cool data repositories for biological and chemical oceanography data sets that you publish it to, and then you even have a citation just from the data set and people can see it. Anyway, is there anything like that? I don't know how you would do it.
Well, I think you said, I think you can process it so what they do when they send you that file where it's anonymized. Do you know what I mean? And so I think you can do that. But I don't know, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know. I will report back as
okay, cool. More. That sounds great.
But that's so cool. Thanks for sharing about your data process. And then, I don't know which one is it. But anyway, yeah.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us on the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. We're delighted to have you as a listener, and we would love to hear from you. And if you want to email us, our address is contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any of your suggestions for future shows or professor quotes that you might want to share with us, or even just things that have come up for you when you were listening to previous episodes. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, we would love if you would spread the word. So the best way to spread word is by telling people you know if you think they should listen to it, or you can leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.